A day in the life of a medieval housewife. Before dawn, when the sky is still heavy and colorless and the boundary between night and morning has not yet been negotiated, she is already awake. The house is dark, not because darkness is chosen, but because light is costly. Fire must be made deliberately. Candles are saved. The hearth holds only embers from the night before, banked carefully under ash. She lies still for a moment, listening, not for silence, but for signs. The breathing of children, the creak of timber as the house settles, wind pressing against wattle and daub. Somewhere beyond the walls, an animal shifts. This is not a single woman, and it is not a single place. It is England or northern France, sometime between 1200 and 1350. It is a household tied to land, obligation, and seasons rather than clocks. And this moment, this waking before light, is not remarkable. It is expected. The day begins before it can be seen. She rises quietly, because waking the household too early is wasteful. Labor must be paced. Strength must be husbanded. The floor beneath her feet is cold. There is no separation between domestic and economic space here. The room she sleeps in is also the room where food will be prepared, tools repaired, accounts remembered, and children disciplined. Privacy is not a concept with much purchase in this world. She pulls on layers of wool, mended repeatedly, their seams telling their own history. Clothing is not a matter of fashion, but of endurance. Each garment represents hours of spinning, weaving, and repair, much of it her own work, or the work of women like her. Before the household stirs, she goes to the hearth. Fire is not assumed, it is made. She kneels, clears ash, exposes the embers, and feeds them dried kindling saved from the previous day. If the embers have died, she will strike flint and steel, careful not to waste effort. Fire is heat, light, cooked food, boiled water, and safety. Without it, the day cannot proceed. As the flame takes, the house begins its slow transition from night to work. This is where the day of a medieval housewife begins, not with a single dramatic task, but with continuity. Her labor does not start something new. It maintains something already in motion. To understand her day, it is necessary to understand her position. She is not merely a wife, and she is not merely at home. The medieval household is an economic unit. It produces, consumes, stores, and transmits resources, and she is central to its operation. Her husband's labor, whether in the fields, the workshop, or the Lord's service, is visible, bounded, and often seasonal. Hers is constant. She is responsible for food preparation, yes, but also for food preservation, rationing, and planning weeks or months ahead. She manages textiles from raw fiber to finished cloth. She tends animals kept near the house. She raises children, but also trains them into labor. She keeps memory of debts, favors, obligations, and customary rights. None of this appears in official records unless something goes wrong. As the fire strengthens, she places a pot to warm water. This water will be used carefully. It may be for porridge, for washing, or for brewing. Brewing is not a specialized trade alone, it is domestic necessity. Ale is safer than water, nourishing, and consumed daily by all members of the household, including children. If she brews today, she must plan for fermentation, storage, and distribution. Brewing badly wastes grain. Brewing too weakly wastes time. These are calculations she performs without writing them down. The household begins to stir. Children wake first, often in confusion, sometimes crying. She quiets them, assigns small tasks immediately. Fetching water, carrying fuel, watching younger siblings. Labor begins early because capacity is learned early. There is no sharp division between care and discipline. She must teach children to work without breaking them. She must correct without wasting energy. She must prepare them for a life in which survival depends on competence. Her husband rises later, not out of privilege, but because his labor will peak later in the day. He eats what she prepares. If there is bread, it is bread she helped produce, grain cleaned, ground, baked, rationed. If there is cheese, she has had a hand in its making or preservation. She does not sit while others eat. There is always something else to be done. As light finally enters the room, filtered through smoke and small openings, the shape of the day becomes clearer. Weather matters. Season matters. The liturgical calendar matters. Obligations to lord or town matter. If it is a fast day, meals must be adjusted. If it is a feast day, extra preparation is required. If it is a day of labor owed to a lord, the household must be organized around absence. Her mind is already ahead of her body. Once the household has eaten, the work branches. If it is spring or summer, she may accompany others to the fields, especially during peak periods like harvest. Medieval women are not confined to the house. They weed, reap, bind sheaves, and carry loads. Their labor is essential, though often unrecorded. If she remains near the house, the work does not lessen. She spins wool or flax whenever her hands are free. Spinning is constant, portable labor. The spindle turns while children are supervised, while pots simmer, while conversations occur. Yarn is produced thread by thread, hour by hour, transformed later into cloth. Textiles are wealth. They clothe the household, pay rents, and serve as goods for market exchange. Poor spinning weakens fabric. Poor fabric shortens the life of clothing. She knows this through experience, not instruction. If animals are kept, a cow, a pig, chickens, she feeds and tends them. She milks if there is milk to be had. She cleans, she monitors health. A sick animal threatens food security months ahead. She also manages waste. Ash, scraps, dung. Nothing is meaningless. Everything has potential use. Time passes without being marked by hours. It is marked by tasks completed, by light shifting, by hunger returning. By midday, she prepares another meal, often simple, often repetitive. Variety is luxury. Nutrition is survival. She eats last or while working. If there is surplus, she may take goods to market. This is not leisure. Markets are spaces of negotiation, risk, and social visibility. Prices fluctuate. Quality is judged. Reputation matters. A woman known to cheat may find herself isolated. A woman known for fairness builds networks of trust. These networks matter when times are hard. At market, she exchanges not only goods, but information. News travels here of disease, of war, of changes in lordship, of marriages and deaths. She listens carefully. Knowledge is protection. If she does not go to market, she may receive others. Neighbors arrive with requests to borrow tools, to share labor, to ask for help with childbirth or sickness. Refusing without cause damages standing. Agreeing without capacity damages the household. She balances constantly. In the afternoon, work continues. Clothes are mended, tools repaired, food preserved if the season allows, herbs gathered for medicine or seasoning. Medical knowledge is domestic knowledge. She knows which plants ease pain, which calm fevers, which help wounds close. This knowledge is practical, accumulated, and passed orally. She also knows when to seek help, from another woman, from a healer, from prayer. Responsibility does not imply isolation. As the day wanes, children grow tired and restless. She manages conflict, hunger, and fatigue simultaneously. Her authority is real, but it is exercised carefully. She must maintain order without alienation. As evening approaches, she prepares the main meal. Fire must be managed again. Fuel is precious, smoke is constant, her eyes sting, her lungs adapt. This is when the household comes together. Stories are told, accounts are reviewed verbally, plans are made. She participates fully. If her husband speaks to neighbors or kin, she listens. Decisions about land, marriage, obligations, these are not made without her input, even if formal authority rests elsewhere. When darkness returns, she cleans, banks the fire, and ensures tools are stored. She prepares for night, which is not rest but vulnerability. Doors are secured, animals are checked, children are settled. Only then does she sit, if there is time. Her body is tired, but her work is not finished. Tomorrow must be anticipated. Grain must last. Cloth must endure. Relationships must hold. This is one day, and it repeats, with variation, across years shaped by childbirth, illness, loss, and survival. Her labor is cumulative. It sustains the household not through moments of heroism, but through endurance. The medieval housewife does not leave monuments, she leaves continuity. To understand her life is not to romanticize hardship, nor to dismiss it. It is to recognize that medieval society rested on work that was constant, skilled, and largely invisible to formal record. This day, unremarkable to her, is the foundation of the medieval world. Night does not end the medieval housewife's responsibilities, it merely compresses them. Sleep comes in fragments, shaped by proximity. Children shift beside her. An infant stirs, demanding attention that cannot be deferred. Illness announces itself in the dark. Coughs, fevers, the unmistakable restlessness of pain. When this happens, the day she planned dissolves before it begins. Care overrides all schedules. She wakes before dawn again not because she chooses discipline, but because necessity does not wait. The household must be restarted every morning. Nothing runs on its own. If there is a baby, the rhythm of the day bends around feeding. Infant mortality is high enough that attachment carries risk, yet care is no less intense. She feeds, cleans, soothes, and watches for signs of danger. Diarrhea, fever, weakness. Knowledge here is experiential, not theoretical. She knows when to worry because she has seen what follows. Children who survive infancy are integrated quickly into work. A 5-year-old can carry water, a 7-year-old can mind animals. By adolescence, labor is full. Childhood, as later centuries will imagine it, does not exist. Dependency is brief. Competence is demanded early. The housewife is the architect of this transition. She teaches by correction rather than explanation. Time for instruction is limited. Mistakes are costly. A dropped pot, a wasted measure of grain, a neglected fire, these have consequences. As children grow, so does her role as manager. She assigns tasks based on ability, temperament, and urgency. She adjusts when weather interferes, rain ruins plans, cold delays others. Flexibility is not a luxury. It is survival. Her authority inside the household is extensive. She controls keys to chests, to storage, sometimes literally. These keys symbolize trust. She knows where food is stored, how much remains, and how long it must last. She decides when to consume reserves and when to endure hunger. Famine is not an abstraction. It is a memory. She remembers years when grain failed, when bread was stretched thin, when children cried from hunger. These memories inform her caution. Even in good years, she plans for bad ones. Preservation is her art. In summer and autumn, she dries fruits, salts meat if there is any to spare, pickles vegetables, stores roots. Each method carries risk. Too much moisture spoils. Too much salt ruins flavor and wastes resources. Failure means hunger months later. She watches the weather constantly. Rain at the wrong moment destroys weeks of work. Heat can be as dangerous as cold. She also watches the calendar, not just seasons, but saints' days, fasts, feasts. These determine what may be eaten, when labor pauses, and when extra work is required. Religious observance is not separate from daily life. It structures it. On feast days, she prepares more. Hospitality matters. Even poor households are expected to mark certain days. A failure to do so is noticed. Hospitality is not generosity alone. It is social insurance. Neighbors remember who fed them, who shared, who refused. In times of need, memory returns. The housewife manages these obligations carefully. She cannot afford endless giving. She cannot afford isolation. Her work is therefore social as much as physical. If a neighbor gives birth, she attends. If someone dies, she helps prepare the body, organizes food for mourners, manages practicalities. Death is familiar. Ritual makes it manageable. These moments interrupt her routine, but reinforce her position. She is essential not only to her own household, but to the network that sustains it. Men's work often takes them outward, to fields, to lords' courts, to markets far away. Her work anchors the community in place. When her husband is absent, on labor service, trade, or war, she manages alone. This is common enough to be expected. She negotiates with officials, she makes decisions, she disciplines. Widowhood is not rare. Death in childbirth, disease, and violence claim many men. A widow may continue to run a household, sometimes with surprising legal autonomy. In some regions, she can hold land, appear in court, and manage resources directly. This autonomy is not ideological, it is pragmatic. The system adapts because it must. The medieval housewife is therefore not powerless, but her power is situational, informal, and contingent. It does not protect her from hardship, it allows her to endure it. As years pass, her body bears the marks of this endurance. Repeated pregnancies weaken her. Heavy labor damages joints. Smoke affects breathing. Medical care is limited. Pain is normalized. Old age, if reached, is both respected and feared. An older woman carries knowledge, but she also depends on others. She hopes the children she raised will care for her. This is not sentiment, it is planning. The household is a long-term project. Her labor shapes not only survival, but memory. She knows family histories, alliances, grudges. She remembers who wronged whom, who owes what. This memory substitutes for written record. In disputes, her testimony matters. In negotiations, her recollection can decide outcomes. Memory is authority. As evening returns again, she closes another day. The pattern repeats with variation. Some days are easier, many are worse. Plague years shatter routines. The sick overwhelm the healthy. Care becomes triage. She watches neighbors die, children die, sometimes her own. She continues because stopping is not an option. After the Black Death, labor shortages alter dynamics. Wages rise. Women's work gains visibility in some sectors. Opportunities appear briefly, unevenly. She adapts again. Throughout all of this, no one calls her work history. Chronicles record kings, wars, councils. Legal documents record disputes. Her day is absent. Yet without her day, none of those records would exist. The medieval housewife does not experience her life as symbolic. It is immediate, demanding, and practical. But from a distance, her labor is structural. It sustains population, economy, and continuity. A single day in her life contains agriculture, industry, education, medicine, and governance at the smallest scale. It is not private, it is foundational. When night falls for the final time, when her work passes to daughters, daughters-in-law, or neighbors, little marks the transition. The house remains. The tasks remain. That is the point. Medieval society does not survive through grand design. It survives through repetition, skill, and resilience, concentrated in places rarely acknowledged. To understand a day in the life of a medieval housewife is to understand the medieval world from the inside, measured not by dates and decrees, but by fires lit, meals stretched, children taught, and resources guarded against uncertainty. Her day ends where it began, with preparation for what comes next, and tomorrow, before the light, it begins again. The rhythm of her life is not marked by beginnings and endings so much as by accumulation. Each day leaves traces, some visible, some not, and these traces shape the days that follow. Nothing resets overnight. Fatigue carries forward, so does knowledge. As the years pass, she becomes more efficient, not because the work lightens, but because repetition sharpens judgment. She learns where effort is wasted and where it must be spent without hesitation. She knows which children can be trusted with which tasks. She knows when grain will stretch and when it will not. She knows the difference between a sickness that will pass and one that will not. This knowledge is never abstract. It is learned through consequence. A loaf baked too quickly teaches patience. Cloth woven too loosely teaches care. A moment's inattention at the fire teaches fear. These lessons do not need to be repeated often. Memory is reinforced by loss. Her sense of time deepens with age. A young woman thinks in days and weeks. An older woman thinks in seasons and years. She remembers how long it takes for a pig to grow, how many winters a roof beam can endure, how long a daughter's dowry must be prepared in advance. Marriage, in her world, is not romance, but logistics bound to custom. When a daughter approaches marriageable age, the housewife's work intensifies. Clothing must be made or improved, linen prepared, household goods assembled, reputation guarded. A daughter's future reflects on her competence. Negotiations are careful. Who will the daughter marry? Where will she go? What labor will she contribute? What support will she receive? These are not decisions made lightly, and they are not made by men alone. Women's assessments matter, even when spoken quietly. If the daughter leaves, the household loses labor. This loss must be planned for. Younger children are trained more quickly. Work is redistributed. Nothing is sentimentalized. Affection exists, but it operates within necessity. The same is true of friendship. Bonds between women are forged through shared labor, brewing together, spinning together, assisting at births. These relationships are practical and emotional at once. They provide support, information, and collective strength. In disputes, women often mediate before men intervene. They know which conflicts can be settled quietly and which will escalate. This mediation is part of social maintenance, and it is unpaid. The medieval housewife is thus a stabilizing force, not because she seeks authority, but because she must preserve functionality. When external pressures intensify, war, taxation, requisition, she absorbs shock. Soldiers passing through demand food, lords raise rents, officials impose levies. The household must respond immediately. She hides what can be hidden. She negotiates what cannot. She stretches meals further. She postpones repairs. She adjusts expectations. Resistance, when it occurs, is often subtle. Grain measured carefully. Labor slowed just enough. Compliance shaped to minimize damage. This is not passivity, it is strategy. Her labor teaches her limits of power. She knows where resistance is futile and where it is possible. She teaches this knowledge implicitly to those around her. Religious life weaves through all of this. Prayer is not separate from work. It accompanies it. She prays while spinning, while kneading dough, while watching over the sick. Faith offers structure, explanation, and sometimes comfort. But faith does not replace action. She prays and acts. If a child falls ill, she prays and applies remedies. If food runs low, she prays and plans. Divine providence and human effort are not opposed. They are layered. This layered understanding is characteristic of medieval life. It resists simple categories. The housewife lives within contradiction without naming it as such. She accepts suffering without seeking it. She endures inequality without assuming it is just. She obeys authority without believing it infallible. Her worldview is not naive. It is pragmatic. As age advances, her role shifts again. Physical labor becomes harder. Authority increases. She supervises more and lifts less. She advises rather than acts when possible. Younger women consult her. Her experience becomes a resource. She is asked how to manage childbirth, marriage, scarcity. Her answers are cautious, shaped by memory. She does not promise ease. She promises survival. Eventually, her presence becomes background. She is no longer at the center of activity, but the household still relies on the systems she established. Her methods persist, even if her hands falter. When she dies, there is no record beyond perhaps a burial note, if that. Her name fades quickly from official memory, but the household she shaped continues, altered but intact. This is how medieval society reproduces itself, not through ideology, but through practice, not through proclamations, but through days lived with care. To watch a single day in the life of a medieval housewife is to see a system operating at its smallest scale. Food production, resource management, education, healthcare, and social order are all present. Nothing is specialized. Everything overlaps. This overlap is often mistaken for simplicity. It is not simple, it is dense. Modern categories, domestic, economic, political, do not apply cleanly. Her work crosses them constantly. She is not just anything. She is a manager, a producer, a teacher, a healer, and a negotiator. She performs these roles without title, wage, or recognition. Yet the medieval world cannot function without her. When historians speak of medieval productivity, population growth, or resilience, they are describing outcomes of labor like hers. When records speak of harvests, rents, or markets, they presuppose her work. Her day is not exceptional. That is precisely why it matters. It is the unremarkable repetition of such days that sustains a civilization. Tomorrow she will wake again before light. She will tend the fire, feed the household, manage labor, and plan for what comes next. She does not imagine history will notice. And it does not. But history rests on her day all the same. By the time the household settles into sleep again, the day has left its mark in ways that cannot be easily counted. A pot has been emptied and scraped clean. Yarn has grown longer on the spindle. A child has learned a task well enough not to be corrected tomorrow. A small decision, how much grain to use, whom to trust, what to delay, has shifted the household's future by a fraction so small it feels invisible. But medieval life is built from such fractions. What makes the medieval housewife difficult to see in history is not that her work lacks importance, but that it lacks interruption. Chronicles notice breaks, wars, famines, coronations, plagues. Her life is defined by continuity. Even catastrophe does not stop her work. It intensifies it. When famine comes, she becomes a rationer. When plague comes, a caretaker. When war comes, a protector of what can be hidden. Each crisis adds layers to her knowledge, never subtracting from her responsibility. This is why her day cannot be reduced to routine. Routine implies predictability. Her life is governed instead by preparedness. Preparedness is learned slowly. It is shaped by watching what fails. A jar cracks in winter. A child grows weaker despite care. A harvest does not last as long as expected. Each failure refines judgment. This refinement is passed on not through instruction manuals, but through example. Daughters learn by watching hands, not listening to rules. They absorb timing, caution, restraint. They learn when to act quickly and when to wait. Waiting is a skill. In a world without abundance, haste destroys resources. The medieval housewife learns patience not as virtue, but as technique. Bread must rise, cloth must set, meat must cure, children must grow. She understands intuitively that some things cannot be forced. This understanding shapes her view of authority as well. Lords demand rents. Priests demand observance. Customs demand obedience. She complies where compliance preserves stability. She resists where resistance can be absorbed without reprisal. Her resistance is rarely open. It is quiet, cumulative, and careful. History often overlooks such resistance because it leaves no dramatic trace, but it shapes outcomes. It determines whether households endure or fracture. It determines whether children survive or vanish from record. The medieval housewife does not imagine herself as strong. Strength is not an identity, it is a necessity. There is no alternative. She also does not imagine herself as central. Centrality is not how her world explains itself. Authority is spoken in male names, lords, kings, priests. Yet when those men are absent, powerless, or dead, it is her systems that persist. The house remains standing because she knows how to maintain it. In this sense, the medieval household is not a private sphere hidden from history. It is history's smallest operational unit. Everything larger depends on it. Armies march because households feed them. Towns trade because households produce surplus. Lords rule because households reproduce labor. Even monasteries rely on lay households to survive. The medieval housewife's day, repeated across millions of homes, is what allows medieval society to exist at all. She does not conceptualize this role. She experiences it. If asked what she does, she would not list tasks. She would say she keeps the house. The phrase understates everything. To keep is to maintain against entropy. It is to prevent collapse through constant attention. It is to hold together materials, people, and obligations that naturally pull apart. This is why her work is exhausting. It is also why it is effective. The medieval world is often described as rigid, fixed hierarchies, fixed roles. But her life reveals a different reality, one of constant adjustment within constraint. Roles exist, but they are elastic. Survival demands it. She bends where she must. She holds where she can. Her day does not end in triumph or reflection. It ends in readiness. Tools are placed where they will be needed. Food is stored where it can be reached. Children are settled where they can be watched. She sleeps, knowing that morning will require her again. This is not tragedy. It is endurance, and endurance, over centuries, becomes structure. When historians speak of medieval stability, of villages that persist, customs that endure, populations that recover after catastrophe, they are describing the cumulative effect of days like hers, not heroic days, ordinary ones. A day in the life of a medieval housewife is not meant to inspire nostalgia or pity. It is meant to correct scale. It reminds us that history is not only made by decisions at the top, but by labor at the bottom that never stops. It reminds us that survival is not passive. It is active, skilled, and learned. It reminds us that the medieval world was not held together by ideology alone, but by people who understood, intimately, how to manage scarcity, risk, and uncertainty. She did not write books. She did not command armies. She did not issue laws. She kept people alive, and in doing so, she sustained a civilization. Tomorrow, before the light, she will wake again. Morning comes again, not as renewal, but as continuation. The fire must be coaxed back to life, water must be carried, the household must be reassembled from sleep into labor. Nothing about this is symbolic to her. It is simply what must be done, and yet from a distance of centuries this repetition acquires meaning, because what she is doing, day after day, year after year, is absorbing uncertainty. Medieval life is saturated with uncertainty. Weather cannot be controlled, illness cannot be predicted, lords can change demands, markets can collapse, death can arrive suddenly, without warning or fairness. The medieval housewife lives at the point where all of these uncertainties converge. Her work does not eliminate risk, it manages it. Risk management is not a modern invention. It is embedded in her choices: how much to store, when to spend, whom to trust, when to comply, when to conceal. She does not speak in probabilities, but she thinks in them. She knows which risks are survivable and which are not. This knowledge is not written down because it cannot be easily formalized. It lives in habit, in timing, in instinct shaped by experience. That is why it is passed from woman to woman. Daughters watch mothers, apprentices watch mistresses, widows teach daughters-in-law. Knowledge moves along domestic lines as reliably as land moves along legal ones. When historians ask how medieval society endured repeated catastrophe, famine, plague, war, they often look to institutions: the church, the manor, the crown. These mattered. But institutions alone do not feed children, care for the sick, or ration food when systems fail. Households do, and within those households, the medieval housewife is the primary stabilizing force. Her labor does not appear heroic because it is preventative. It works best when nothing dramatic happens, when the winter passes without starvation, when illness does not spread, when children reach adulthood. Success looks like normalcy. This is why her contribution is so easily overlooked. History remembers rupture. She works to prevent it. Even when rupture occurs, she works to limit damage. During plague years, she isolates the sick when possible, tends them when necessary, and manages the aftermath. She prepares bodies. She feeds survivors. She rebuilds routines. Routines are not trivial. They are psychological anchors. They restore a sense of order when explanations fail. The medieval housewife restores order not by explanation, but by action. She does not ask why catastrophe happens. She asks what must be done next. That orientation to the next task, the next day, the next season, is what allows medieval society to recover again and again. Her world does not reward introspection. It rewards responsiveness. If she reflects, it is briefly while spinning or stirring a pot, and those reflections do not lead to abstraction. They lead to decisions. Should she save this? Should she share that? Should she prepare for hunger now, or trust this year will be better? Every answer carries cost. There is no neutral choice. This constant decision-making gives her a kind of authority that is rarely acknowledged. She may not command others formally, but she directs outcomes. Her judgment shapes who eats, who works, who survives. In this sense, power in the medieval household is not located where formal language places it. It is located where consequences are managed. The medieval housewife manages consequences. She does so without expecting recognition. Recognition does not feed families. Results do. When she is young, her competence is tested. When she is older, it is relied upon. When she is gone, its absence is felt. A household that loses such a woman often collapses quickly. Food spoils. Children falter. Resources are mismanaged. The difference becomes visible only after it is too late. That visibility, too, rarely enters the record. And yet, if we slow down enough, if we follow a single day with care, we can see the structure of medieval life more clearly here than in any charter or chronicle. We can see how labor is organized without bureaucracy, how knowledge circulates without writing, how authority operates without proclamation, how survival is achieved without abundance. A day in the life of a medieval housewife is not an anecdote. It is a system in miniature. It contains the medieval economy in its rawest form, transformation of raw materials into sustenance. It contains medieval medicine, care without cure, judgment without certainty. It contains medieval education, training through imitation and correction. It contains medieval politics, negotiation under unequal power. All of it unfolds in a space small enough to overlook. That is why returning to her day matters, not to elevate her into myth, not to claim she lived well, not to suggest her life was fair, but to recognize that medieval society, so often described through abstraction, was lived through bodies like hers. Bodies that woke before light, that worked without rest, that endured without explanation, that preserved life long enough for history to happen. When we imagine the Middle Ages only through castles and cathedrals, we misunderstand its foundation. Stone monuments endure because someone fed the people who built them. Armies marched because someone rationed grain at home. Kings ruled because households reproduced labor and loyalty. The medieval housewife's day is where all of that begins. It begins at the hearth. It moves through labor. It ends in preparation, and it begins again. Not because she believes the world will improve, but because stopping is not an option. In that relentless continuity lies the true rhythm of medieval life. And if we listen closely, past the noise of battles and decrees, we can still hear it, the crackle of fire before dawn, the murmur of work, the quiet endurance that carried a civilization forward one ordinary day at a time. As years accumulate into decades, her sense of what matters becomes narrower and deeper at the same time. Large events, wars declared far away, rulers crowned or deposed, enter her world only when they alter demands on the household. A new tax, a requisition, a conscription of labor. Until then, such events remain distant noises. What never recedes is the immediacy of need. She becomes adept at distinguishing what can be ignored from what cannot. Rumors can be ignored. Weather cannot. A passing quarrel can be endured. A failing roof cannot. This hierarchy of attention is learned through consequence, and it is one of her most valuable skills. It shapes how she listens, how she responds, and how she teaches. By middle age, she no longer rushes to every problem. She has learned that some resolve themselves, and others do not respond to haste. This measured response is often mistaken for resignation. It is not. It is triage. Her body bears wear, but her judgment sharpens. She knows which seasons are most dangerous. Late winter, when stores are low and illness spreads. Early spring, when hunger lingers and labor resumes before strength returns. She prepares for these periods months in advance, tightening consumption, delaying use, conserving energy. If she fails, the cost is immediate. There is little margin for error in medieval life. That is why competence matters more than intention. Goodwill does not feed children. Skill does. This truth governs how women evaluate one another. A capable woman is respected regardless of temperament. A careless one is avoided. Reputation circulates quietly, reinforced by observation rather than gossip. Her reputation is one of her most important assets. It affects marriage prospects for her children. It affects willingness of neighbors to help. It affects how officials treat her household. Reputation is not about morality alone. It is about reliability. Can she be trusted to return what she borrows? Can she keep confidence? Can she manage resources without waste? These questions matter more than abstract virtue. This practical moral economy is one of the least acknowledged features of medieval life. Ethics are lived before they are theorized. The housewife enforces them daily through example and correction. If she allows waste, others suffer. If she allows cruelty, disorder spreads. If she allows neglect, vulnerability grows. She may not speak of justice, but she practices it within her reach. As she ages further, her relationship to time shifts again. She no longer plans decades ahead. She plans continuity. Who will take over which task? Who can be trusted with keys? Who understands the rhythms she has internalized? Succession is not ceremonial. It is gradual. She lets go of some responsibilities while watching carefully to ensure they are not mishandled. A daughter-in-law learns under her supervision. A granddaughter is corrected gently, then less gently, until competence replaces instruction. This transfer of knowledge is fragile. It depends on proximity, patience, and survival. A death at the wrong moment, a mother before a daughter is ready, can fracture the household's ability to cope. Such losses ripple outward. This fragility is why medieval life clings so tightly to continuity. Change is risky. Innovation is cautious. New methods are adopted only when proven. Tradition is not worshipped for its own sake. It is trusted because it has worked before. The housewife embodies this trust. She is not opposed to change. She is opposed to untested change that threatens survival. When new tools, crops, or practices appear, she evaluates them carefully. Will this improve yield? Will it increase risk? Can it be reversed if it fails? Her conservatism is not ideological. It is empirical. This empirical mindset, grounded in experience rather than theory, coexists with religious belief without contradiction. She does not see faith and pragmatism as opposites. She prays for good harvests and prepares for bad ones. She trusts God and locks the door. The medieval world often appears to modern observers as governed by belief. From her vantage, it is governed by necessity. Belief offers meaning, necessity dictates action. Her actions are what keep belief from becoming hollow. As old age advances, she withdraws physically but remains present socially. She sits near the hearth, where work still happens. She watches. She comments sparingly. When she speaks, others listen. Her authority is now memory. She remembers how things were done before rents increased, before land was divided, before neighbors died. This memory is not nostalgia. It is context. It helps younger members understand why certain choices exist, why certain compromises are accepted. Without memory, adaptation becomes dangerous. The housewife provides that memory. When she finally dies, the loss is felt immediately and unevenly. Some tasks go undone. Some stores are misused. Some decisions are delayed too long. Over time, the household adapts. It must. But for a while, there is disorder. This disorder is not recorded as tragedy. It appears, if at all, as a brief decline, a thinner winter, a poorer harvest, a child lost to illness. Then continuity resumes. History moves on. What remains, across centuries, is the pattern. A day in the life of a medieval housewife is not isolated. It is one thread in a vast fabric woven from countless similar days. Together, they form the texture of medieval society more accurately than any chronicle. They explain why villages endure, why customs persist, why populations recover, why institutions have something to govern. Without her day, the medieval world collapses into abstraction. With it, the Middle Ages become legible, not as a time of darkness or romance, but as a lived reality sustained by unending, skilled labor. She does not ask to be remembered, she asks only that tomorrow be possible. And so, before the light, she wakes again. By the time she reaches the final stretch of her life, the shape of the world around her has altered in ways both subtle and unmistakable. Fields have changed hands, paths have shifted. Some neighbors are gone, replaced by others whose histories she does not fully know. New children fill old spaces, old customs loosen at the edges. She notices these changes not as progress or decline, but as adjustment. She has lived long enough to know that the medieval world is never static. Despite how it is later imagined, it moves slowly, unevenly, often painfully, but it moves. And she has moved with it, adapting without ever naming adaptation as such. Her final days are quieter, but not empty. She still rises early, even when her body protests. Habit has become instinct. She warms herself near the hearth and watches others perform tasks she once did without thought. She corrects when necessary. She lets mistakes happen when they are survivable. This restraint is deliberate. She understands that survival requires not only knowledge, but confidence in those who will carry it forward. Overcorrection weakens judgment. Silence, used sparingly, strengthens it. The household no longer depends on her hands, but it still depends on her presence. Her memory anchors decisions. Her approval matters, even if it is not explicitly requested. When she speaks of the past, she does not tell stories for entertainment. She tells them to warn, to contextualize, to explain why certain shortcuts are dangerous. She remembers winters when grain ran out too soon. She remembers years when generosity saved lives and years when it ruined households. These memories are not lessons, they are tools. Eventually, even this role fades. Illness comes quietly or suddenly. Care reverses direction. The women she trained now tend to her. They feed her, clean her, manage her pain as best they can. The same skills are applied, now turned inward. She does not expect comfort, she expects competence. Death, when it comes, is not extraordinary. It is one more task for the household to manage. Her body is prepared. Prayers are said. Food is shared. Life adjusts. The next morning, the fire is lit again. This is where her story truly ends, not with her death, but with the fact that nothing stops. The day resumes because it must. The systems she helped build continue to function, imperfectly but effectively. Her legacy is not a name remembered in writing. It is a pattern maintained. This is the hardest thing for later centuries to grasp. Modern history looks for moments of change, for decisive acts, for visible authorship. The medieval housewife offers none of these. Her influence is diffused, cumulative, and inseparable from daily life. Yet without her, medieval society could not sustain itself long enough for kings to rule, churches to rise, wars to be fought, or ideas to be debated. Her day is the substrate beneath all of it. When historians speak of medieval resilience, they are describing the result of labor like hers. When they speak of medieval stagnation, they are often failing to see how much work stability requires. Stability is not the absence of effort. It is effort so constant it disappears from view. A day in the life of a medieval housewife is therefore not a curiosity. It is an explanation. It explains how a world with limited technology, frequent catastrophe, and rigid hierarchies nevertheless endured for centuries. It explains how communities survived shocks that might otherwise have destroyed them. It explains how continuity was achieved without central planning or formal recognition. It was achieved through people who woke before dawn, managed scarcity with care, transmitted knowledge without writing, and accepted responsibility without reward. Her life does not invite admiration in the modern sense. It invites understanding. Understanding that history is not only shaped by those who act loudly, but by those who act reliably. Understanding that endurance is not passive, but skilled. Understanding that the medieval world was not held together by ignorance, but by competence, exercised quietly, day after day. If we slow down enough, if we follow her from hearth to field, from market to sickbed, from youth to age, we begin to see medieval life as it actually was, demanding, adaptive, and sustained by labor that left no monument. The fire at dawn, the careful ration, the taught child, the preserved grain, the remembered winter. These are the true structures of the medieval world, and they begin, every day, with her. If we remain with her just a little longer, long enough to let the pace of her life set our own, we begin to notice something that is easy to miss when history is told from above. Nothing about her day is accidental. What appears to later eyes as routine is, in fact, a series of judgments refined by exposure to risk. She does not simply repeat tasks because they are customary. She repeats them because deviation carries consequences she has already measured. Habit is not mindlessness. It is compressed knowledge. This is why medieval households are conservative without being static. Change enters slowly, filtered through experience. When a new practice appears, whether a tool, a crop, a method of preservation, it is tested quietly, at the margins. One pot, one field, one season. Only when it proves itself does it spread. The housewife is often the one who decides whether it spreads at all. Her authority here is informal but decisive. She determines whether a change is survivable. Men may bring back ideas from markets, from towns, from service elsewhere, but she evaluates them against reality, against stores, against labor capacity, against the bodies of children. If it fails, she absorbs the damage. If it succeeds, the household benefits. This evaluative role is one of the most underappreciated aspects of medieval life. It explains why some innovations stall and others persist. It explains why medieval society changes slowly but not blindly. The medieval housewife is not hostile to improvement. She is hostile to collapse. This distinction matters. As centuries pass and historians later describe the Middle Ages as resistant to progress, they often mistake caution for ignorance. They do not see the daily calculus that governs survival. They do not see the cost of being wrong. To live one day in her place is to understand why recklessness is a luxury medieval households cannot afford. It is also to understand why her work leaves so little trace. She does not create surplus knowledge. She consumes it immediately. Every insight is folded back into practice. There is no archive except memory, no record except continuity. When her household thrives, nothing is written. When it fails, records speak only of outcome, not cause. And so, over time, her presence recedes from view. What remains are abstractions: the peasantry, the household, women's work. These phrases flatten what was once intensely specific. They obscure judgment, skill, and agency beneath generality. But if we resist that flattening, if we insist on staying with her day, we recover something essential. We recover scale. History is often told at the scale of decisions that change borders or doctrines, but most human life unfolds at the scale of sustenance. At that scale, power looks different, agency looks different, meaning looks different. At that scale, a woman deciding how much grain to grind today is shaping tomorrow more directly than a distant decree. This does not mean medieval housewives were secretly ruling the world. It means they were holding it together. And holding together is harder than ruling. Ruling issues commands. Holding together manages consequences. Ruling can fail without immediate effect. Holding together cannot. This is why her day feels relentless. There is no pause in which responsibility lifts. Even rest is strategic, taken only when it preserves future labor. And yet, within this pressure, there is life. There is humor, often dry and sharp. There is affection, expressed in shared work more than words. There is pride in competence, even if it is never articulated. There is satisfaction when a winter passes without hunger, when a child survives illness, when stores last until spring. These satisfactions are quiet. They are not celebrated. They are felt and then folded back into the next day. Over centuries, this pattern produces something extraordinary: endurance without stasis. The medieval world does not freeze in place because her labor constantly adjusts it. It bends rather than breaks. It absorbs shock rather than shattering. It changes without announcing change. This is why, when great transformations finally do arrive, demographic shifts, economic expansion, new technologies, they have something to build on. They encounter households already skilled in adaptation, already accustomed to managing uncertainty. The medieval housewife does not prepare for modernity. She prepares for survival. Modernity inherits the result. And so, when we ask what a day in her life means, the answer is not symbolic. It is structural. Her day is the reason medieval society can exist long enough to be studied at all. It is the reason villages persist across generations, the reason labor systems function, the reason children grow into adults, the reason memory outlasts catastrophe. Her life is not dramatic, it is decisive. If history is the story of how human beings endure long enough to change, then her day is history at its most fundamental level. It begins before dawn. It ends in preparation. It repeats without recognition. And through that repetition, a world is sustained. When the fire is lit tomorrow, it will not be lit in her name. When bread is baked, it will not carry her mark. When children grow strong enough to work, they will not know who first taught them how, but all of it will bear her imprint. Because the medieval world does not stand on stone alone, it stands on days like hers, quiet, demanding, unrecorded, and indispensable. And if we stay with that understanding, if we refuse to hurry past it, one final truth comes into focus. The medieval housewife's day does not merely support history, it defines its limits. Everything larger than the household, manor, parish, kingdom, church, operates only within the margins her labor creates. Taxes cannot be paid if grain is mismanaged. Armies cannot be fed if households collapse. Faith cannot be practiced if bodies are not sustained. Even rebellion, when it comes, depends on the same domestic competence that allows obedience. This means that medieval power is always conditional, even when it pretends otherwise. Lords issue commands, but they rely on households to interpret and absorb them. Kings declare wars, but women decide whether food lasts through winter. Priests preach salvation, but women determine whether children survive long enough to hear it. This does not make the medieval housewife a hidden ruler. It makes her the point at which all authority becomes real, or fails. From her perspective, power is not abstract. It is measured in weight, carried, food stored, bodies healed, and time endured. Authority that ignores these realities becomes dangerous. Authority that adapts to them survives. Over generations, this quiet filtering shapes society more reliably than law or force. It is why medieval life does not collapse as often as its dangers suggest it should. It is why communities recover after plague. It is why traditions persist even when institutions falter. The housewife does not preserve tradition because it is sacred. She preserves what works. That practicality, passed down silently, is one of the medieval world's deepest strengths. When we speak of the Middle Ages, as if they were defined by belief alone, we miss this entirely. Belief mattered, but belief survived because someone ensured the household endured first. The medieval housewife lives at the intersection of body and structure, necessity and meaning. She does not articulate theories of social order, she enacts them, and this enactment leaves no manifesto. It leaves children who know how to work. It leaves food where it is needed. It leaves habits that make survival possible. It leaves continuity. Continuity is not glamorous. It does not announce itself. It is noticed only in its absence. This is why the medieval housewife disappears from history so easily. When her work succeeds, nothing seems to happen. The day proceeds, the season turns, life continues. History prefers interruption, but interruption is only possible where continuity already exists. So, when we reconstruct a day in her life, slowly, deliberately, without drama, we are not adding a footnote to medieval history. We are restoring its center of gravity. We are reminding ourselves that the medieval world was not held together by ignorance or blind obedience, but by relentless competence exercised under constraint. That competence was learned, it was shared, it was defended, and it was never optional. Her day begins before light not because she is virtuous, but because the world demands it. Her labor continues not because she is submissive, but because stopping would cost lives. Her knowledge endures not because it is written, but because forgetting would be fatal. This is not a story of empowerment in modern terms. It is a story of responsibility. Responsibility carried without recognition. Responsibility inherited without choice. Responsibility fulfilled anyway. A day in the life of a medieval housewife is therefore not an illustration of the past. It is an explanation of how the past remained possible at all, and when the fire is lit again tomorrow by another woman, in another house, in another century, the same logic will apply. Before the bells, before the fields, before the records, the day begins, and the world holds. When the fire catches again, when the first thin line of smoke curls upward and the house shifts from night into labor, there is nothing to distinguish this morning from 1,000 others, and that, in the end, is the point. The medieval housewife's day is not meant to be remembered individually. It is meant to be repeated. History often searches for origins, the first law, the first charter, the first rebellion, the first invention. But medieval life does not begin with firsts. It begins with persistence, with the decision made every morning to continue. That decision is never abstract. It is made with cold hands, an empty stomach, and the knowledge that failure will be paid for immediately. It is made without assurance that effort will be rewarded. It is made anyway. This is the ethical core of her life, though she would never describe it as such. She does not believe that work guarantees justice. She knows it does not. She has seen good people suffer and careful households fall apart. What she believes, because experience has taught her, is that not working guarantees collapse. So she works. She works when harvests fail. She works when children die. She works when authorities demand more than can be given. She works when hope is thin and explanations insufficient. Her labor is not fueled by optimism, it is fueled by obligation to those who depend on her now and to those who will depend on the systems she maintains long after she is gone. This sense of obligation is not sentimental, it is structural. It binds generations together without ever naming itself as tradition. When later centuries imagine the Middle Ages as rigid or stagnant, they are often mistaking endurance for immobility. They do not see the daily adjustments, the constant recalibrations, the quiet innovations that keep life viable under pressure. Those adjustments happen here, at the scale of the household, in decisions too small to record, but too important to neglect. A pot placed closer to the fire, a measure of grain withheld, a child taught sooner than expected, a risk avoided because it failed once before. These decisions accumulate. They do not create revolutions. They create survival. And survival, over time, creates the conditions for everything else. The medieval world produces cathedrals because households feed masons. It produces universities because households raise students. It produces states because households sustain populations long enough to be governed. It produces memory because households transmit it when institutions falter. The housewife's day is therefore not peripheral to medieval history. It is its precondition. Without it, the Middle Ages are uninhabitable. That is why her life feels relentless when we follow it closely. There is no relief written into the system. There is only continuity maintained through effort that does not pause for recognition. Modern readers often ask where joy exists in such a life. The question itself reveals distance. Joy exists not in escape from responsibility, but in its successful discharge. In a winter endured, in a child who lives, in a store that lasts, in a household that holds together despite strain. These moments are not celebrated, they are absorbed, and absorption is what allows them to endure. When she dies, the fire is still lit. When her name fades, her methods remain. When centuries pass, her logic persists. The medieval housewife does not leave behind a philosophy, but she leaves behind a world capable of sustaining philosophy. She does not shape history through proclamation. She shapes it through repetition, and repetition, when carried across generations, becomes structure. So, if we wish to understand medieval life, not as myth, not as caricature, but as lived reality, we must begin here, not in castles, not in councils, not in chronicles, but in the quiet hour before dawn when a woman kneels at the hearth, coaxes life back into embers, and prepares, once again, to hold the world together for another day. Nothing about this moment is dramatic. Nothing about it is recorded. And yet, without it, there is no medieval history at all. Stay with that moment just a little longer. The house is still half dark, the fire is awake, but the day is not yet fully claimed. Outside, the world waits, fields damp with dew, paths still empty, animals quiet. This pause, brief and unnoticed, is the closest thing her life has to reflection. She does not think of herself as standing at the center of anything. She thinks of tasks, of what must be done before hunger returns, of what cannot be postponed, of what will break if neglected. And yet, from this narrow focus, something vast emerges, because every medieval institution, every manor court, every tithe, every levy, every campaign, every council assumes that this fire has been lit, that this household is functioning, that someone has already absorbed the risk, managed the scarcity, and carried the cost forward into the day. Her work is upstream from power. This is why it is so rarely acknowledged. Power prefers to imagine itself self-sustaining. It speaks in commands, not dependencies. But dependency is the truth of the medieval world, and she lives at its core. If the harvest fails, She compensates until she cannot. If demands increase, she stretches resources until they tear. If disease spreads, she tends the sick until tending becomes impossible. Only then does collapse become visible, and by then the work she did beforehand has already delayed it, softened it, and shaped who survives. This is not resilience as a slogan. It is resilience as practice. The medieval housewife does not endure because she believes suffering is virtuous. She endures because endurance is required. She does not romanticize hardship. She manages it. Her world is not one of endless obedience. It is one of constant negotiation between need and possibility, between obligation and survival, between what is demanded and what can be given without breaking the household. This negotiation happens silently, continuously, and without appeal. That silence is deceptive. It has led later centuries to imagine medieval women as passive, invisible, marginal. In truth, their labor is simply not performative. It does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. It seeks results. And the result, repeated across millions of households, is a civilization that holds together longer than it has any right to. When we talk about the Middle Ages lasting 1,000 years, we are not talking about stasis. We are talking about the success of people like her in preventing total collapse again and again. The medieval housewife does not experience history as eras. She experiences it as winters survived. She does not measure time in rains. She measures it in children grown, stores depleted, stores rebuilt. She does not ask whether the world is changing. She asks whether it will hold, and more often than not, because of her, it does. So when we ask what a day in the life of a medieval housewife truly was, the answer is not poetic and not small. It was the day on which medieval society was made possible again, not once, not dramatically, but reliably, the fire lit before dawn. The meal stretched, the child taught, the risk absorbed, the household steadied. No chronicler wrote it down, no charter recorded it, no monument marked it, but everything else rested on it. And tomorrow, before the light, it will happen again, somewhere else, by another woman, whose name will also vanish, whose labor will also disappear into continuity. That disappearance is not failure. It is success so complete that history forgets to look for it. And if we listen carefully, past the bells, past the proclamations, past the battles, we can still hear it. The quiet work that never stopped, the day that never announced itself, the life that held the medieval world together, one ordinary morning at a time. And now, at last, we can step back, not away from her, but wide enough to see what her day truly represents. The medieval housewife does not live at the margins of history. She lives beneath it, carrying its weight. Her day is not a story of exceptional hardship, nor is it a tale of quiet heroism meant to inspire admiration. It is something more demanding and more honest. It is the demonstration of how a society survives when certainty is scarce and failure is fatal. Everything we associate with the medieval world, its hierarchies, its faith, its economies, its wars, its learning, depends on a foundation that is never proclaimed. That foundation is the household, and at its center stands her labor. She is not the symbol of medieval life. She is its mechanism. Her work converts land into food, time into continuity, and children into the next generation of laborers, believers, and subjects. She performs these transformations without ceremony, without recognition, and without the illusion that they are optional. When medieval society succeeds, it is because her day succeeds. When it fails, it is because her capacity has been exceeded. This is why her life resists simplification. She cannot be reduced to oppression or empowerment, piety or drudgery. Those categories belong to later arguments. Her reality is governed by necessity. She lives where ideology ends and survival begins. The medieval housewife does not ask whether her labor is valued. Value is not theoretical. It is measured in outcomes: a winter endured, a child alive, a household intact. These outcomes are her ledger, and that ledger balances more often than history remembers. What later centuries inherit, population growth, economic recovery, institutional stability, is built quietly atop these balanced days. Long before cities expand or states consolidate, households hold. That holding is not passive. It is active, skilled, and relentlessly adaptive. She adapts to scarcity without language for economics. She manages health without medicine as we know it. She educates without schools. She governs without authority. She does all of this because the alternative is collapse. This is the final truth her day reveals. Medieval life is not sustained by belief alone, nor by power alone, nor by tradition alone. It is sustained by competence exercised continuously under pressure. And that competence, overwhelmingly, is domestic. So when we imagine the Middle Ages, when we picture stone walls, crowned heads, armored men, and robed clerics, we must remember that none of it stands without the unseen labor that makes tomorrow possible. The medieval housewife's day begins before dawn and ends in preparation. It repeats until repetition itself becomes structure. It leaves no monument. It asks for no acknowledgement. But it endures. And because it endures, the medieval world endures with it. If history is the record of what survives long enough to matter, then her life matters more than most. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was necessary. The fire lit again, the meal prepared, the child guided, the risk absorbed, another day held, and that, more than any battle, any decree, any crown, is how the medieval world lived. There is nothing left to add, only something to sit with. The medieval housewife's day does not resolve into a lesson, a moral, or a triumph. It resolves into continuity. And continuity, more than any ideology or institution, is what defines the medieval world. When later centuries look backward, they often search for origins of modern ideas, modern freedoms, modern systems. They ask when change began. They ask who moved history forward. In doing so, they overlook the deeper question: how did history last long enough for change to matter at all? The answer is not found in castles or councils. It is found here, in the quiet competence that prevented hunger from becoming collapse, in the judgment that turned scarcity into survival, in the repetition that transformed fragility into endurance. The medieval housewife did not imagine herself as part of a grand narrative. She imagined tomorrow. She imagined whether there would be enough. She imagined whether the household would hold, and because she did, it did. Her world did not endure because it was stable. It endured because it was constantly repaired. That repair work, unending, uncelebrated, and largely female, is what allowed medieval society to absorb catastrophe without dissolving. Plague did not end the world because households rebuilt routines. Famine did not erase communities because women recalculated survival. War did not empty villages forever because someone remained behind to keep life viable. This is the deepest misunderstanding about the medieval past. It is not that people believed too much or knew too little. It is that survival required more intelligence, adaptability, and restraint than later narratives are willing to credit. The medieval housewife embodied that intelligence without naming it. She practiced adaptability without framing it as innovation. She exercised restraint because restraint kept people alive. Her day did not point toward a future she could imagine. It pointed toward a tomorrow she had to secure. And that is why it matters, because history is not made only by those who change the world. It is made, first, by those who keep it from falling apart. The medieval housewife did not leave behind ideas that could be quoted or monuments that could be admired. She left behind something more difficult to see and more difficult to replicate: a functioning world under relentless pressure. That world was imperfect. It was unequal. It was often cruel. But it endured. And it endured because, before dawn, someone lit the fire again. Not in hope, not in defiance, but because the day required it. That is the life. That is the work. That is the medieval world, held together one ordinary day at a time. If we allow ourselves to remain inside that continuity, if we resist the instinct to conclude, summarize, or extract meaning too quickly, we begin to understand something even more unsettling about the medieval housewife's life. Her endurance is not exceptional, it is normal. That is precisely what makes it so powerful. The medieval world does not survive because a few people endure extraordinary hardship. It survives because most people endure ordinary hardship every day, competently enough that disaster does not compound into extinction. The housewife's day is not an edge case. It is the median experience of survival. This realization forces us to recalibrate how we understand resilience. Resilience is often framed as recovery after shock, but for her, resilience is preemptive. It is built into how the day is structured before anything goes wrong. She does not wait for crisis to adjust. She assumes crisis will come. This assumption shapes everything. It shapes how much food is consumed even in good times. It shapes how many favors are owed and how many are deliberately left unpaid. It shapes how much effort is spent on comfort versus security. It shapes how children are trained to expect responsibility rather than protection. None of this is articulated as philosophy. It is absorbed as reality. When later historians describe medieval life as harsh, they are not wrong. But harshness alone does not explain survival. Harsh environments kill populations that cannot adapt. What matters is not exposure to hardship, but capacity to manage it. The medieval housewife is a manager of exposure. She knows, instinctively, how close to the edge the household can safely operate. She knows how far stores can be drawn down before danger sets in. She knows when to stop giving, when to start saving, when to ask for help, and when asking would make things worse. This knowledge is not static. It evolves as conditions change. After plague, labor becomes scarcer, wages shift, social relations loosen slightly. She adapts. After war, supplies are disrupted, risks increase. She adapts again. After a good run of years, she does not relax fully because memory cautions her. Memory is her greatest resource. Medieval households do not have insurance. They do not have state welfare. They do not have reliable external rescue. What they have is accumulated memory of what worked before and what failed. That memory lives in women. It lives in their warnings, their hesitations, their refusals to be optimistic. It lives in their insistence on keeping something back just in case. It lives in their quiet resistance to pressures that promise short-term gain at long-term cost. This is why her conservatism is misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like resistance to improvement. From the inside, it is resistance to forgetting. Forgetting is deadly. Forgetting the winter when grain ran out. Forgetting the illness that spread too quickly. Forgetting how fast security can vanish. The medieval housewife remembers so others do not have to relearn through loss. This role, custodian of memory, is not ceremonial. It is active. She invokes the past when decisions are made. She says, "Last time this was tried, it failed." She says, We survived because we did it differently. She says, "Do not assume this will last." These statements are not pessimism. They are experience. They shape the household's future more decisively than optimism ever could. This is why medieval life does not swing wildly between extremes. It oscillates within limits. Boom is restrained. Bust is softened. Growth is cautious. Decline is mitigated. At the center of this moderation is her judgment. Her labor also shapes the emotional economy of the household. Medieval emotional life is often imagined as either brutally repressed or explosively violent. In reality, it is regulated through necessity. Excessive anger wastes energy. Excessive grief paralyzes labor. Excessive joy encourages waste. She does not eliminate emotion, she channels it. Grief is permitted, but work continues. Anger is acknowledged, but contained. Affection is expressed through care rather than indulgence. This emotional discipline is not coldness. It is survival strategy. Children learn quickly that feelings exist, but tasks remain. This lesson, learned early, shapes medieval adulthood. It produces people who can endure loss without collapse, who can function amid uncertainty, who can accept imperfection as permanent. These are not traits celebrated in modern narratives. They are nevertheless essential to endurance. The medieval housewife does not teach hope as expectation. She teaches hope as persistence. Persistence does not require belief in improvement. It requires belief that effort still matters, even when outcomes are uncertain. This belief is never stated. It is enacted. When she rises before dawn after burying a child. When she prepares food during famine, knowing it may not be enough. When she trains another woman, knowing she may not live to see the results. She acts because action preserves possibility. Possibility is all medieval life can afford. This reframes the entire medieval experience. The Middle Ages are not a time waiting passively for enlightenment or progress. They are a time actively holding conditions steady enough for change to become possible later. That holding happens here, not in theory, not in policy, but in practice. The medieval housewife's day teaches us something modern societies often forget, that complexity can be managed without mastery, that survival does not require control, and that continuity can be an achievement rather than a default. She does not control the world, she keeps it workable. That distinction matters. Control seeks dominance. Workability seeks endurance. Workability tolerates imperfection. Control does not. Medieval society survives because it prioritizes workability over control, and nowhere is this clearer than in the household. Every morning, when she lights the fire again, she is not repeating yesterday. She is recalibrating today based on yesterday's outcome. That recalibration is subtle, constant, and cumulative. Over years, it creates households that can absorb shock. Over generations, it creates societies that can survive instability. Over centuries, it creates history. This is why the medieval housewife's life resists narrative climax. There is no moment when her work pays off. There is only continuation. And continuation, sustained long enough, becomes legacy. Not a legacy of ideas, not a legacy of institutions, but a legacy of viability. The medieval world is viable because she makes it so, one day at a time. And if we listen, if we slow ourselves to her pace, we begin to understand that this is not a lesser form of historical agency. It is the most fundamental one. History cannot begin until someone ensures tomorrow is possible. She does that, every day, before the light. If we remain with her through that realization, through the understanding that her endurance is not exceptional but structural, we begin to see why medieval history so often feels paradoxical. It appears simultaneously fragile and enduring, violent and stable, oppressive and resilient. That paradox dissolves when viewed from the level of her day, because medieval society is not designed to prevent suffering. It is designed to prevent disintegration. Those are not the same thing. Suffering is common in her life. Hunger, pain, loss, fear. These are expected, not aberrations. What is feared most is not suffering itself, but cascading failure, one loss leading to another until nothing holds. Her labor exists to interrupt cascades. When illness strikes one child, she isolates if possible. When a tool breaks, she improvises rather than abandoning the task. When food runs short, she reduces consumption gradually rather than allowing sudden depletion. This stepwise management is crucial. It turns crisis into strain, strain into endurance, endurance into survival. The medieval housewife's world is therefore not optimized for happiness or justice. It is optimized for absorption, absorption of shock, absorption of loss, absorption of uncertainty. This is why medieval systems appear cruel to modern eyes. They are not built to minimize pain, they are built to minimize collapse. Compassion exists, but it is constrained by calculation. Mercy is weighed against sustainability. She feels this tension constantly. If she gives too much to a neighbor, her own children suffer. If she withholds too much, she risks isolation. If she rests too long, work piles up. If she works too hard, she weakens herself. Every decision is a balance between competing harms. This is the emotional and ethical environment in which medieval life unfolds. It produces people who are neither naive nor callous, but calibrated. Calibrated to scarcity, calibrated to risk, calibrated to impermanence. The medieval housewife is the primary calibrator. Her judgments shape how much is tolerated, how much is resisted, and how much is endured. She does not have the luxury of absolutes. She operates in gradients. This gradient-based thinking is one of the most sophisticated forms of practical intelligence humans develop. It does not rely on fixed rules, it relies on situational awareness, and it is learned only through exposure. This is why her knowledge cannot be easily transferred across time or place. It is not a set of instructions, it is a disposition to watch carefully, to adjust early, to assume instability, to act anyway. When medieval households fail, it is often because this disposition is disrupted by sudden death, by forced displacement, by overwhelming extraction, by violence that exceeds absorptive capacity. When they succeed, it is because someone like her keeps the system within tolerable bounds. From this perspective, medieval power structures look different. Lords and kings appear less omnipotent, more parasitic on household stability. Their power expands when households can absorb demands and contracts when they cannot. This is why revolts often coincide with famine or plague, not because ideas suddenly change, but because absorptive capacity is exceeded. The medieval housewife understands this intuitively. She knows when the household is nearing its limit. She knows when compliance is no longer sustainable. Her quiet signals, reduced output, delayed response, refusal framed as inability are early indicators of systemic stress. These signals rarely make it into records, but they shape outcomes. When enough households reach their limit, history becomes visible again through revolt, migration, or collapse. Until then, history remains quiet. Her day is the silence before noise, and that silence is not empty. It is full of work. This reframes how we should understand medieval continuity. It is not the result of blind tradition or passive acceptance. It is the result of constant, skilled labor applied to keeping life workable under pressure. That labor is overwhelmingly domestic, it is overwhelmingly female, and it is overwhelmingly invisible. The medieval housewife does not seek invisibility. She simply does not have the time or incentive to narrate herself. Narration does not preserve food or heal bodies. Action does. So she acts. She acts when outcomes are uncertain. She acts when recognition is absent. She acts when authority is unjust. She acts when belief falters. She acts when hope is thin. She acts because inaction has known consequences. This is not heroism in the modern sense. It is obligation accepted as fact, and it produces a kind of strength that modern cultures, oriented toward spectacle and self-expression, often struggle to recognize. A strength that is quiet, a strength that is cumulative, a strength that does not escalate, a strength that holds. If we follow her long enough, through youth, maturity, age, and death, we begin to see that her life is not merely representative of medieval women. It is representative of medieval humanity under constraint. Most people in medieval Europe lived closer to her experience than to that of kings or clerics. Their survival depended on the same skills: restraint, adaptation, memory, and endurance. Her day teaches us that medieval history is not best understood as a series of dramatic events punctuated by long stagnation. It is better understood as a continuous negotiation with risk carried out at the smallest possible scale. That negotiation is where history actually happens. Everything else, law, war, doctrine, economy, is layered on top of it. And so, when we ask what it means to spend a day in the life of a medieval housewife, the answer is not descriptive alone. It is diagnostic. It reveals how a society functions when survival is uncertain and resources are limited. It reveals how power depends on what it cannot see. It reveals how continuity is achieved without planning, ideology, or control. It reveals, finally, that the medieval world was not held together by ignorance or inertia. It was held together by people who woke before dawn, assessed reality without illusion, and did what had to be done again, not because they expected the world to improve, but because they were responsible for making sure it did not end. And that responsibility, carried quietly, daily, without pause, is the true engine of medieval history. It turns embers into fire. It turns scarcity into survival. It turns ordinary days into centuries. Before the light, she wakes. And because she does, the world continues. If we allow that conclusion to settle, if we resist the urge to step away too quickly, we begin to sense just how demanding this form of responsibility truly was. Because the medieval housewife did not only manage scarcity, she managed uncertainty without reassurance. There was no promise that endurance would be rewarded, no guarantee that careful planning would be enough, no assurance that tomorrow would be better than today. The moral universe she inhabited did not operate on fairness, only on consequence. And she knew this deeply. This is why her work was so unsentimental. She did not believe that effort entitled her to success. She believed only that effort was the condition of possibility. Without it, failure was certain. With it, survival remained merely possible. That distinction shaped an entire world view. In later centuries, societies would come to believe that progress was inevitable, that systems improved over time, that hardship was a problem to be solved permanently. The medieval housewife lived before such assumptions were plausible. For her, improvement was temporary, and regression always near. The best outcome was not transformation, it was continuation. This understanding governed how she approached every relationship. Authority was respected, but never fully trusted. Custom was followed, but never blindly. Faith was practiced, but never allowed to replace action. Hope existed, but it was disciplined. She did not confuse meaning with rescue. If God provided, it was through means, through hands, preparation, and restraint. Divine order did not exempt anyone from labor, it demanded it. This theological pragmatism is often missed in modern portrayals of medieval belief. From the outside, medieval religiosity appears absolute and consuming. From inside the household, it is integrated and conditional. Prayer accompanies work. It does not excuse its absence. The housewife prays while spinning. She prays while caring for the sick. She prays while burying the dead. And then she continues. Her faith does not suspend reality. It frames it. This framing is crucial to understanding medieval emotional endurance. She does not expect justice in the short term. She does not expect clarity. She expects obligation. Obligation gives structure where certainty cannot. That structure, thin but resilient, holds together households across generations. Children raised in it learn early that life is not arranged around their comfort. They learn to contribute, to endure correction, to accept limits. This upbringing produces adults capable of absorbing shock without collapse. Not because they are hardened beyond feeling, but because they have never been taught to expect protection from reality. This is not cruelty for its own sake. It is preparation. Preparation for a world in which protection is unreliable. The medieval housewife does not articulate this philosophy. She enacts it through routine, and because routine shapes expectation, it shapes character. This is one reason medieval society can mobilize labor quickly in times of crisis. People are accustomed to effort. They do not expect rescue to arrive before they act. They know that delay is dangerous. That knowledge begins in the household. It begins with a woman who insists that tasks be done before hunger returns, before light fades, before weather turns. It begins with correction delivered without explanation, because explanation costs time. From this perspective, the medieval household is not merely economic, it is formative. It produces a certain kind of human being, one capable of living without guarantees. This capacity is not accidental. It is cultivated, and it is cultivated because the alternative is extinction. This brings us to the deepest reason the medieval housewife's day matters historically. It explains why medieval societies could survive conditions that would overwhelm more fragile systems. Not because medieval life was easier, it was harder, but because expectations were calibrated to hardship rather than comfort. The housewife's day calibrated those expectations. She did not promise ease, she promised continuity. That promise, kept often enough, allowed trust to exist at all. Trust that effort mattered, trust that tomorrow could be managed, trust that survival, while uncertain, was not arbitrary. Without that trust, despair would have spread more quickly than plague. Despair is the enemy she guards against most carefully. She does so not through optimism, but through structure. Structure gives people something to do when meaning falters. It channels fear into action. It prevents paralysis. When famine looms, she rations rather than panics. When illness spreads, she isolates rather than flees. When death comes, she prepares rather than collapses. These responses are not instinctive, they are learned, and they are taught deliberately through daily practice. That teaching is invisible because it happens without ceremony. No one declares that children are being trained to endure. They simply are. This invisibility is why modern observers struggle to see medieval intelligence where it most clearly resides. They look for abstraction, articulation, innovation. They miss execution. The medieval housewife's intelligence is executable. It produces outcomes under pressure. It adapts without discourse. It persists without reward. And it scales. Scaled across millions of households, This intelligence creates a civilization capable of surviving repeated catastrophe, not thriving by modern standards, but enduring. Endurance is not glamorous. It does not announce itself. It does not leave monuments. But it is what allows monuments to exist at all. When historians marvel at medieval recovery after the Black Death, at population rebound, at the persistence of institutions, they are often describing the downstream effects of household-level adaptation. They are describing what happens when enough people know how to manage loss without disintegration. That knowledge lives here, in the fire lit again, in the pot stretched further, in the child corrected gently, then firmly, in the decision to act rather than wait. The medieval housewife's day is therefore not merely illustrative, it is explanatory. It explains why medieval history did not end with its disasters. It explains why continuity mattered more than progress. It explains why the past lasted long enough to have a future. And perhaps most importantly, it explains something about history itself. History is not driven forward by those who seek change alone. It is sustained by those who make change survivable. The medieval housewife did not imagine herself as part of history's movement. She imagined herself as responsible for tomorrow, and because she did, history could continue to move at all. Before dawn, she woke. She assessed reality without illusion. She acted without certainty. She preserved possibility. And because she did, the medieval world endured long enough for us to ask what it was like. And if we remain with that thought, if we let it sit long enough to become uncomfortable, we begin to realize that the medieval housewife's day does something even more profound than sustain a society. It sets the ceiling on what that society can afford to believe. Ideas in the medieval world do not float freely. They are constrained by what daily life can support. Grand theological visions, political ambitions, and moral claims must eventually pass through the narrow gate of the household. If they demand more than the household can absorb, they fail. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. This is why medieval ideologies tend toward moderation in practice, even when they appear absolute in theory. A king may claim divine right, but he cannot eat divinity. He eats bread. A priest may preach charity, but charity cannot empty a granary without consequence. A lord may demand labor, but labor has limits imposed by bodies that must also survive winter. The medieval housewife lives at the point where belief meets biology. She does not argue with doctrines. She tests them against reality, not deliberately, not rebelliously, but through the unavoidable logic of survival. If a rule threatens the household's ability to function, it is bent, delayed, reinterpreted, or quietly ignored. This does not make medieval society cynical. It makes it functional. From her vantage point, the world is not divided into sacred and secular, political and domestic. Everything is material in the end. Everything must be converted into food, warmth, health, and continuity, or it remains abstract. This is why medieval life appears inconsistent when viewed from above. Laws are proclaimed and unevenly enforced. Ideals are preached and selectively applied. Customs vary from place to place. To an external observer, this looks like disorder or hypocrisy. From the household, it looks like calibration. The housewife understands that rules cannot be absolute if life is not. She understands that survival requires interpretation. This interpretive labor is constant and invisible, and it shapes how medieval society actually operates. It is also why medieval authority relies so heavily on local enforcement, custom, and negotiation. Central power cannot reach into every household. It depends on households choosing to comply when compliance is tolerable and resisting when it is not. The medieval housewife is one of the primary agents of this choice. She decides how much grain can be given, how much labor can be spared, how long obligations can be met before damage becomes irreversible. Her decisions do not appear in records as political acts. They appear, if at all, as fluctuations, lower yields, delayed payments, absences from labor. But these fluctuations accumulate, shaping what power can demand and what it must concede. In this way, the medieval housewife participates in governance without ever naming it. Governance, at its most basic level, is the management of limits, and she manages limits daily. This reframes medieval gender roles in a way that resists both romanticization and dismissal. She is not secretly free within an oppressive system, nor is she merely oppressed without agency. She occupies a position of constrained necessity that grants her real influence without formal authority. Her power is not to command, it is to refuse collapse. That refusal is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself as resistance. It appears as persistence in the face of pressure. But persistence shapes outcomes more reliably than defiance. This is one reason medieval revolts are relatively rare compared to the intensity of hardship. People endure until endurance becomes impossible, and endurance is extended again and again by domestic labor that absorbs strain. The medieval housewife extends that endurance. She does so even when doing so harms her personally. She sacrifices rest, health, and sometimes dignity to keep the household functioning. This sacrifice is not celebrated. It is expected. Expectation is the heaviest burden she carries. She is expected to know without being taught, expected to remember without recording, expected to care without compensation, expected to adapt without acknowledgement. These expectations are not written down, but they are enforced socially. A woman who fails in them is judged harshly, not because she violates ideals, but because her failure has immediate consequences for others. This judgment reinforces competence, but it also isolates failure. There is little tolerance for error in a system with thin margins. Understanding this helps explain the emotional texture of medieval life. It is not that medieval people lacked empathy. It is that empathy was constantly negotiated against survival. Compassion existed, but it was rationed like everything else. The housewife learns this early. She learns that she cannot save everyone. She learns that care must be prioritized. She learns that some losses must be endured to prevent greater ones. This is not moral failure. It is structural necessity, and it shapes how medieval people understand responsibility. Responsibility is not universal. It is relational. One is responsible first for those who depend directly on one's labor. The housewife embodies this ethic more fully than anyone else in the medieval world. Her responsibility is not abstract or chosen. It is imposed by proximity. Whoever eats her food, sleeps under her roof, or relies on her preparation falls within her moral horizon. This horizon is both narrow and intense. It does not extend to humanity. It extends to the household. And that household-centered morality explains much about medieval social behavior: loyalty to kin over strangers, suspicion of outsiders, fierce protection of local custom. These are not signs of moral deficiency. They are adaptations to a world where resources are scarce and responsibility is immediate. The medieval housewife does not have the luxury of universal ethics. She has the burden of particular ones. This is another reason her day matters historically. It explains why medieval societies could coexist with suffering without collapsing into nihilism. Meaning was not derived from abstract justice. It was derived from fulfilling obligation where fulfillment was possible. The question was not, "Is this fair?" It was, "Can this be borne?" Her life is structured around that question. When demands become unbearable, systems break. But until then, they bend. And they bend because people like her absorb pressure until absorption fails. This is why medieval history moves slowly, not because people are incapable of change, but because households resist disruption until disruption becomes unavoidable. The medieval housewife is the brake on history's acceleration. She slows change not out of fear, but out of calculation. She knows that rapid change kills households faster than it improves them. She is not opposed to transformation, she is opposed to instability. Stability in her world is not comfort, it is predictability. Predictability allows planning. Planning allows survival. Survival allows continuity. Everything else is secondary. If we follow her through one more cycle, another winter, another harvest, another year of loss and endurance, we see that her life does not build toward resolution. It builds toward replacement, toward the moment when someone else takes over her role, armed with knowledge she transmitted but never formalized. Her success is measured by whether that replacement can function. If they can, her work has succeeded. If they cannot, it has failed. This is a brutal metric. It leaves no room for personal fulfillment. It leaves no space for legacy beyond continuity. And yet, it works. It works well enough that medieval society persists for centuries under conditions that might otherwise have destroyed it. It works well enough that ideas, institutions, and cultures have time to evolve rather than vanish. The medieval housewife does not advance history. She gives it time, time to recover, time to adapt, time to change. And that gift of time, earned daily through labor that never pauses, is one of the most powerful historical forces there is. So when we imagine her one last time, before the fire, before the light, before the household stirs, we should not imagine insignificance. We should imagine pressure, and skill, and restraint, and the quiet competence that turns one more day into another year, another generation, another century. History moves because someone holds it steady first. She does that every day. If we stay with her still, if we refuse even now to lift our eyes toward abstraction or summary, we reach the final depth of what her day reveals. The medieval housewife does not merely hold time, she teaches a society how to live inside time. Time, for her, is not an arrow pointing forward. It is not progress. It is not destiny. It is a cycle of pressure, relief, and pressure again. Winter returns, hunger returns, work returns, loss returns. Nothing is conquered permanently. What can be learned is how to meet return. This is the most profound inheritance she passes on. Children raised under her care do not learn to expect resolution. They learn to expect recurrence. They learn that effort today does not eliminate effort tomorrow. They learn that survival is not an achievement unlocked once, but a condition maintained repeatedly. This expectation produces a distinctive mental posture. It produces people who do not panic when hardship reappears, people who do not interpret difficulty as failure, people who understand that endurance is not evidence of stagnation, but of competence. This posture is medieval. It is not hopeful in the modern sense, and it is not despairing. It is calibrated. It assumes difficulty without surrendering agency. It assumes loss without abandoning obligation. The housewife does not teach this posture through words. She teaches it by example. Children watch her continue after exhaustion. They watch her resume after grief. They watch her work without certainty of reward. And they absorb the lesson that life is something you carry, not something that carries you. This is why medieval societies are able to sustain inequality without constant revolt, suffering without collapse, and uncertainty without paralysis. Not because people lack imagination, but because imagination is disciplined by experience. The housewife is the primary disciplinarian of imagination. She does not allow fantasy to replace preparation. She does not allow promise to replace storage. She does not allow belief to replace effort. In doing so, she anchors the household, and by extension the society, inside what is possible rather than what is wished. This anchoring limits cruelty as much as it limits aspiration. It limits cruelty because unrestrained extraction destroys the very households on which power depends. Lords who push too far find labor vanish, land abandoned, communities hollowed out. The brake on that process is not ideology. It is domestic refusal, quiet, cumulative, and decisive. The medieval housewife knows when nothing more can be given. Her refusal is not dramatic. It appears as exhaustion, as inability, as absence. But it forces adjustment. Power that ignores it eventually starves itself. This is why medieval authority is always negotiated, even when it claims absolutism. Negotiation happens not only in courts or councils, but in kitchens, barns, and storerooms. It happens when she decides how much to hand over, when she decides whether to borrow or endure, when she decides whether compliance is survivable. Her day is therefore political in the deepest sense, not because it seeks power, but because it determines limits. Limits are where politics becomes real. And yet, she does not experience herself as a political actor. She experiences herself as responsible. Responsibility, not influence, is her lived category. This distinction matters. Modern narratives often search for agency where people self-identify as agents. The medieval housewife does not. She identifies as caretaker, manager, mother, wife. Agency emerges as a consequence of fulfilling those roles, not as a declared aim. She does not want to shape the world. She wants the world not to fall apart. That desire shapes the world more effectively than ambition ever could. If we imagine, for a moment, a medieval Europe without women like her, without the daily recalibration, without the memory of past failures, without the restraint born of lived consequence, the picture collapses quickly. Famine would cascade, authority would overreach, communities would fragment. The medieval world survives not because it is well designed, but because it is constantly repaired. She is the repair. Repair is never glamorous. It restores function, not perfection. It leaves scars rather than monuments. But it allows life to continue under conditions that would otherwise be fatal. This is why her work leaves so little trace. Repair aims to erase evidence of damage. When it succeeds, nothing appears to have happened. History records damage. It rarely records repair. And so, when we read medieval history and see endurance, persistence, and continuity, we must understand that these are not passive states. They are outcomes of relentless, skilled intervention at the smallest scale. They are the product of days like hers. A day in the life of a medieval housewife is not a vignette. It is not illustrative. It is explanatory. It explains why medieval society did not collapse under pressures that should have destroyed it. It explains why institutions lasted long enough to evolve. It explains why culture persisted despite catastrophe. Most importantly, it explains why history itself could continue. History requires survivors. Survivors require systems. Systems require maintenance. She is the maintenance. And maintenance, by its nature, is endless. There is no final day when her work is complete. There is no moment when survival becomes automatic. There is only repetition, refined by memory and judgment. That is why her day has no climax. That is why it resists narrative satisfaction. That is why it must be followed slowly, patiently, without seeking resolution. because her life does not resolve, it continues. And in that continuation lies the medieval world's greatest achievement, not progress, not enlightenment, not transformation, but durability. Durability built from fire and grain, from care and restraint, from memory and refusal, from a woman who wakes before dawn and prepares, once again, to absorb the weight of the day, not because she believes it will change everything, but because without her, nothing else can happen at all. And now, finally, we reach the quiet edge of the story. Not an ending, but a horizon beyond which nothing new needs to be said, only understood. The medieval housewife's day does not point forward to resolution. It circles back on itself. It returns to the same questions, the same pressures, the same necessities. And in that return, something profoundly historical occurs, because history, at its deepest level, is not the story of change. It is the story of maintenance under conditions that resist it. The medieval housewife lives entirely within that truth. She does not experience her life as a contribution to continuity. Continuity is simply the absence of failure. And failure in her world is not abstract. It has names, faces, and graves. It is the child who does not survive winter, the neighbor whose household dissolves, the land that can no longer be worked because bodies are gone. These are not lessons, they are warnings. And she responds to warnings with action, not reflection. Her intelligence is therefore oriented downward, not upward. It does not seek universal principles, it seeks local viability. What will work here, with these people, under these conditions, now? That orientation makes her invisible to grand narratives, but indispensable to lived history. The medieval housewife does not need to understand the world, she needs to keep it going. This is why her knowledge is granular. She knows the exact weight a child can carry without injury. She knows the sound of grain that will spoil. She knows the look of illness before it becomes obvious. She knows how long hunger can be endured before it becomes dangerous. These are not transferable insights. They cannot be written down in general form. They are bound to bodies, places, and memory. And yet, across medieval Europe, millions of women hold similar knowledge, adapted to local conditions but structured by the same logic. Together, they form an unrecorded system of expertise that underwrites everything else. This is why medieval society is far more sophisticated than it appears when judged only by literacy, technology, or centralized power. Its sophistication is distributed. It resides where survival decisions are made daily, not where theory is articulated. The medieval housewife is one of the primary nodes of that distributed intelligence. Her day teaches us something uncomfortable about historical visibility, that what is most essential is often least visible, and what is most visible is often least essential. Castles fall, dynasties end, laws are repealed, doctrines change, but the need to feed people, care for the sick, train the young, and manage scarcity does not change. That work persists across regimes, beliefs, and borders, and so does she. Even when names, languages, and authorities shift, the structure of her day remains recognizably the same. Fire, food, care, judgment, preparation, endurance. This constancy is not stagnation, it is infrastructure. Just as roads allow armies and merchants to move, her labor allows society itself to move through time. Without her, every crisis would reset history to zero. With her, history accumulates. This accumulation is slow, uneven, and fragile, but it is real. The medieval world accumulates memory, technique, custom, and resilience not because it is well designed, but because it is well tended. And tending is never finished. The medieval housewife does not expect her work to be complete. She expects it to be continuous. That expectation shapes her emotional life as much as her labor. She does not dream of release. She dreams of adequacy. Adequacy is not inspiring, it is sustaining. A winter that can be endured, a harvest that can be stretched, a household that can hold. These are her benchmarks of success, and because those benchmarks are modest, they are often met. This is why medieval societies survive repeated disaster, not because they are immune to shock, but because their standards for success are calibrated to reality rather than aspiration. The medieval housewife calibrates those standards daily. She does not promise safety. She promises effort. She does not promise fairness. She promises care where possible. She does not promise improvement. She promises attention. Attention is the most valuable resource she has. Attention allows her to notice small failures before they become catastrophic. Attention allows her to intervene early, to adjust gradually, to prevent cascading loss. This attentiveness is exhausting, and it is constant. Modern life often celebrates efficiency, the reduction of attention, the automation of care. Medieval life cannot afford this. Everything depends on vigilance. Nothing runs on its own. And so she watches. She watches the fire. She watches the children. She watches the stores. She watches the weather. She watches people. Watching is work. It consumes time and energy, but it prevents surprise. Surprise is deadly in a world without buffers. Her day is therefore a practice of anticipation, not prediction, anticipation. She does not know what will happen, but she prepares for what might. That preparation is the medieval answer to uncertainty, and it works. Not perfectly, not permanently, but often enough that villages persist, often enough that populations recover, often enough that culture survives, often enough that history continues. This is the final meaning of her day. It is not that she represents medieval womanhood or domestic labor or gendered suffering alone. She represents the human capacity to live without guarantees and still act as though tomorrow matters. That capacity is not natural. It is cultivated, and it is cultivated here, in the repetition, in the restraint, in the refusal to collapse. So when we imagine her one last time, before the light, before the household wakes, before the world makes its demands, we should not imagine anonymity. We should imagine density, a life dense with responsibility, dense with consequence, dense with unrecorded intelligence. Her day does not shout. It does not interrupt. It does not announce itself as history. But it is history's condition of possibility. And if we listen carefully, if we quiet the noise of events and let the rhythm of her labor set the pace, we can finally hear what medieval life actually sounded like. Not the clash of swords, not the tolling of bells, but the steady, unending sound of work done well enough, long enough, to keep the world from falling apart. Before dawn, she wakes. And because she does, the medieval world does too. And here, at last, the story can rest, not because it has reached a conclusion, but because it has returned to its beginning. The medieval housewife's day does not end with insight. It ends with readiness. That is the final, unsettling truth. When she lies down at night, there is no sense of completion. There is no ledger balanced once and for all, no assurance that what she has done will be enough. She sleeps knowing that what she preserved today may be threatened tomorrow. She sleeps knowing that effort does not accumulate into safety, only into the chance to continue. And yet she sleeps, not in ignorance, not in denial, but in acceptance of a world where certainty is unavailable and responsibility remains. This acceptance is not resignation, it is composure. Composure under pressure, composure without guarantee. composure earned through repetition. This is what her life teaches a civilization. Modern histories often search for moments when people realized something, realized injustice, realized possibility, realized change. The medieval housewife realizes something else entirely, much earlier and much more deeply. That life is not solved, it is managed. That realization does not lead her to despair, it leads her to work. Work that is careful rather than ambitious. Work that is corrective rather than transformative. Work that does not aim to perfect the world, but to keep it inhabitable. This orientation explains why medieval society could endure contradictions that later ages find intolerable. It could hold belief and doubt together, hierarchy and negotiation together, suffering and meaning together, because daily life required it. The household was the crucible where these tensions were made livable, and at the center of that crucible stood her, not elevated, not celebrated, but indispensable. Her labor does not redeem the medieval world. It does not make it just. It does not make it gentle. It makes it possible. And possibility, sustained long enough, becomes history. This is why the medieval housewife's day matters more than any single event recorded in parchment or stone. It is why no battle, no treaty, no doctrine can be fully understood without returning here, to the place where food was measured, care was given, and risk was absorbed before it ever reached the level of chronicles. She is not outside history. She is beneath it, holding it up. When later centuries imagine the Middle Ages as static, they mistake endurance for inertia. When they imagine medieval women as silent, they mistake invisibility for absence. When they imagine medieval life as governed solely by faith or force, they miss the third power entirely: competence. Competence exercised daily, locally, without theory. Competence that did not seek to change the world. Competence that simply refused to let it collapse. That refusal, quiet, stubborn, unrecorded, is one of the most powerful historical forces there is. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It does not produce monuments. It produces continuity. And continuity is the rarest achievement of all. So, if we are to leave her now, if we are finally to step away from the hearth, the storeroom, the careful counting of grain, we should leave without illusion. We should not tell ourselves that her life was noble in a romantic sense. We should not tell ourselves that her suffering was meaningful because it led to something better. We should not console ourselves with the idea that progress justified the cost. None of that was available to her. What was available was responsibility, and she met it. Day after day, season after season, year after year. Before dawn, she woke. She assessed reality without softness. She acted without certainty. She prepared without promise. And because she did, the medieval world endured, not gloriously, not justly, but long enough to become history at all. That is the power of her day. Not that it changed the world, but that it held it together when everything else was trying to pull it apart. And in that holding, quiet, relentless, unseen, lies the truest legacy of medieval life.